The moment you hear steel snap in the dark, you already know something permanent just got erased. That sound woke me before the alarm ever had a chance, a sharp metallic crack cutting through the quiet like it didn't belong in a neighborhood where the loudest thing at night was usually sprinklers ticking across manicured lawns. And for a second, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, heart steady but alert, because when you grow up around construction sites and job trailers and early morning pours, you learn the difference between normal noise and something that means damage, real damage. The kind that doesn't fix itself by morning. And when I stepped outside barefoot onto the cold concrete of my back patio, the air hit me first, that dry dust smell mixed with something faintly metallic, like fresh cuts in steel, and then I saw it. Or more accurately, I didn't, because where my fence had stood for 3 years straight, a clean, straight line of cedar posts and reinforced panels set exactly 12 inches inside my surveyed boundary. There was nothing, just open ground, raw dirt. Tire impressions pressed deep like footprints from something heavy that didn't care where it rolled, and the silence around it felt wrong, like the land itself was holding its breath. And I remember walking forward slowly, gravel crunching under my feet. That familiar sound now sharper, louder, because there was no barrier anymore to break the space between my property and theirs, no line, no definition, just absence. And that's when I saw the cut ends, steel brackets sheared clean, bolts. Missing, not broken, removed, deliberate, precise, like someone knew exactly what they were doing and didn't want to leave anything accidental behind. And the realization settled in my chest not as anger, not yet, but as clarity, because fences don't just disappear overnight unless someone wants them gone, unless someone thinks they have the right to decide where your boundary ends and theirs begins. And I didn't need a note or a notice to know exactly who that someone was, because in Willow Creek Estates, there was only one person who treated property lines like suggestions instead of law. Rebecca Holloway, HOA president, white Lexus, always parked just a little too close to other people's driveways like proximity itself was a statement. And as I stood there looking at the empty stretch where my fence used to be, I could almost hear her voice, that calm, polished tone she used at meetings, talking about community flow and shared space optimization, like those words meant anything when they were backed by nothing but assumption. And the thing is, what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my fence wasn't just a fence, it wasn't decoration, it wasn't privacy, it was precision. Every post placed based on a certified survey, every anchor set below frost line, every inch calculated to sit exactly where the law said my land ended. And when you remove something like that, you don't just take down wood and steel, you expose a system. You test it, you force it to respond. And as the first light of morning started to creep over the rooftops, casting long shadows across that empty strip of dirt, I felt something shift, not anger, not frustration, something colder, more deliberate. The kind of focus that comes when a problem stops being personal and starts becoming structural, because this wasn't about replacing what was lost. This was about redefining what could never be taken again. And I stood there, hands at my sides, breathing in that dry, dusty air, already seeing it in my head. Not a fence, not something they could touch and remove in the dark, but something else, something heavier, something permanent, something that didn't ask permission to exist. And in that moment, with the ground still marked by their tracks and the line between our properties wide open, I made a decision I wouldn't say out loud to anyone yet, because the best responses don't start with noise. They start with understanding exactly where the boundary really is and how to make sure no one ever forgets it again. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops and the neighborhood started its usual routine of garage doors humming open and coffee mugs clinking against kitchen counters, I was already standing at the edge of that empty line with a tape measure in one hand and my boots laced tight. The ground still cool from the night, but already beginning to harden under the weight of what had happened. And there is something about measuring land first thing in the morning that feels different, quieter, like the numbers carry more truth before the day has a chance to distort them. So I pulled the tape out slow, letting it glide over the dirt, anchoring it where the original corner marker should have been. Except it was gone, not broken, not buried, gone. And that told me everything I needed to know, because you do not accidentally remove a survey marker. You do that when you are trying to rewrite a boundary. And I could feel that familiar steadiness settle in my chest. The same one I used to rely on when I was running site checks back in Houston, walking. Half-poured slabs at 6 in the morning with a clipboard and a level. Knowing that if something was off by even half an inch, it was going to cost someone real money later. Only this time it was not a client problem or a contractor mistake. This was mine, and it had my name on it in a way no blueprint ever could. And as I crouched down, brushing away loose dirt with my hand, I could still see the faint imprint where the marker had been driven, a circular indentation, clean edges, which meant it had not been yanked out in a rush. It had been pulled straight, controlled, probably with the right tools, which meant whoever did this did not just think they had authority, they assumed it. And I stood up slowly, looking across the open stretch toward Rebecca's side of the property, where her lawn rolled out in that perfectly maintained green she was so proud of, edges trimmed sharp enough to look artificial, like something out of a catalog. And right at the boundary, or where it used to be, I could see fresh tire marks crossing over, cutting a path that had not existed 2 days ago, a path that connected directly to the widened access lane the HOA had been quietly pushing for over the last few months. The same proposal I had voted against at the last meeting, the same one she had smiled through while explaining how it would benefit the entire community. And that is when the pieces started lining up in a way that made the whole thing feel less like an incident and more like a plan, because this was not about my fence being inconvenient. It was about my fence being in the way, and I could still hear my father's voice clear as anything, standing out on a job site when I was 17, handing me a stake and a hammer, telling me to set it right the first time, because boundaries are not something you adjust later without consequences. And back then I thought he was talking about construction, about keeping lines straight and corners square, but standing there now with my property opened up like it belonged to someone else, I understood what he really meant. Because boundaries are only as strong as the willingness to enforce them. And if you let someone move one, even a little, they will keep moving it until it is no longer yours at all. And I straightened up, sliding the tape measure back in with a sharp click, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the open space. And for a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in, the smell of cut earth, the faint hum of a distant lawn mower starting up, the early sunlight catching the edges of disturbed soil where something had been removed and something else was about to take its place. And I realized that whatever came next was not going to be a conversation or a complaint filed through the HOA portal. It was going to be something far more exact, something measured in inches and reinforced in materials that do not bend to opinion, because they thought removing a fence erased a line. But all they really did was give me a clear view of exactly where to rebuild it in a way that no one would ever question again. Rebecca Holloway did not rush into things, and that was the first detail most people missed about her, because from the outside she looked like every other HOA president you have ever seen, mid-50s, always dressed like she might run into a camera crew at any moment, light-colored blazer even in the Texas heat, sunglasses perched just high enough to signal control without hiding her expression, and that white Lexus parked at a perfect angle in her driveway, like it was part of the landscaping. But what set her apart was not how loud she was. It was how measured everything felt, every decision, every letter, every smile calibrated just enough to seem reasonable while moving the line a little further each time. And I had been watching that pattern since the first week I moved in, back when the biggest issue was a notice about my mailbox height being a 1/4 inch off their community standard, a number she quoted like it came from federal law, even though it was printed on a sheet she had typed herself. And at the time I let it go, adjusted the post, figured it was easier to play along than to push back on something that small. But small is how she built momentum, one correction, one notice, one friendly reminder at a time until people stopped questioning where the authority actually came from. And over the past year I had seen it escalate, not dramatically, never enough to trigger immediate backlash, just steady pressure, new guidelines about driveway use, then landscaping uniformity, then shared access language buried in meeting notes that most people did not read, and every time someone hesitated she would lean on that same calm tone, explaining how it was all for property value, for cohesion, for the benefit of everyone. And most of the neighborhood accepted it because it was easier than digging through documents or challenging someone who spoke like she already had the answer. But I had noticed something else, something quieter, the way her proposals always seemed to align with expansion, not improvement, paths getting wider, access points shifting, boundaries softening. And when you work in construction long enough, you learn to recognize when space is being prepared for something bigger, Because no one invests in changing infrastructure unless they plan to use it later. And standing there that morning with my fence gone and the ground opened up like a corridor, it finally made sense in a way it had not before. This was not about rules. It was about control over land. And land is never about aesthetics. It is about leverage. And Rebecca understood that better than anyone else in this neighborhood, which is why she never raised her voice, never made a scene. She did not need to. She let paperwork and slow adjustments do the work for her. And as I looked across at her property, I saw her step out onto her driveway, coffee in hand, moving with that same unhurried confidence. And for a moment her eyes met mine across the open stretch. No fence between us now, just distance and intent. And she gave a small nod. Not an apology, not even acknowledgement, more like confirmation, as if to say this was already decided, already part of a plan that had been moving long before I realized I was in it. And I could feel the weight of that settle, not as pressure, but as clarity. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand that the system you are dealing with is not random but designed, you stop reacting and start calculating. And Rebecca had been calculating for months, maybe longer, moving pieces slowly. Enough that no one pushed back hard enough to stop her. But she had made one assumption that morning that changed everything. She assumed I would respond like everyone else, adjust, compromise, accept the new version of the line she had created. And as I stood there with the empty boundary stretching between us, I realized she had just given me something she had not intended to give anyone, a clean slate. A moment where the old line was gone and the next one had not yet been defined. And in construction, that moment is where all the important decisions get made. Because whatever you build next does not just replace what was there before, it sets the standard for everything that comes after. And I knew exactly what kind of standard I was about to set. The first truck rolled in just after 9, not fast, not loud, just a steady diesel hum that did not belong to the usual rhythm of the neighborhood. And I watched it from the edge of my driveway as it eased along the widened strip where my fence used to stand, tires pressing deeper into the same path that had been carved overnight, like it had already been accepted as permanent. And behind it came a second vehicle, smaller, a utility cart with a clipboard mounted to the dash, and that was when I knew this was not cleanup. This was continuation, because people do not bring clipboards to accidents. They bring them to projects. And sure enough, the truck stopped right where my boundary line had been, engine idling, heat waves rising off the hood in the growing sun, and a man stepped out wearing a reflective vest, glancing around with that casual confidence of someone who expects no resistance. And I walked toward him slow, boots hitting gravel in a steady rhythm, the smell of diesel and warm rubber mixing in the air. And when he saw me, he gave a polite nod, the kind contractors give when they assume you are just another homeowner passing by, not the one whose land they are standing on. And I asked him what they were doing, kept my voice level, neutral, and he tapped the clipboard like the answer was already printed there. Said they were preparing the ground for a community access extension. Said it like it was routine, like it had been approved and settled. And I could feel the words settled differently this time, heavier, because hearing it out loud confirmed what I had already started to piece together. This was not about removing a fence. This was about replacing a boundary with a pathway. And before I could respond, I heard that familiar sound behind me, the soft click of a car door closing, and I did not need to turn around to know who it was. But I did anyway, because some moments you face directly, and Rebecca was already walking toward us, coffee still in hand, sunglasses on despite the sun barely climbing high enough to justify them. Her pace unhurried, controlled, like she had all morning. And when she reached us, she did not even look at the empty ground first. She looked at me, just a brief glance, measured, then turned to the worker and asked if everything was on schedule. And he nodded, flipping a page on his clipboard, pointing to a line I could not see from where I stood, and she smiled slightly, satisfied. Then finally shifted her attention to the space where my fence had been, as if noticing it for the first time, and said something about how open the area felt now, how it improved flow between properties, and the words hung there for a second, polished and clean, completely disconnected from the reality under our feet. And I asked her where the approval for this was documented, not raising my voice, just asking. And she tilted her head slightly, like the question was unnecessary, said it was. Covered under the latest community improvement resolution, referenced a meeting from 2 weeks ago, the one where she had introduced the idea of expanding shared access. And I remembered that meeting clearly, remembered how the language had been vague, how the map she showed had no defined measurements, just arrows and shaded areas, nothing that replaced a surveyed line. And I told her that resolution did not override property boundaries. And for the first time, just for a second, her expression shifted, not much, just enough to register that I was not following the script she expected, and then it smoothed out again, replaced with that same calm tone, explaining that everything was being handled properly, that the HOA had the authority to make adjustments for the benefit of the community. And that was the moment it stopped being a misunderstanding, because authority does not erase ownership, and I could feel the ground under my boots, solid, unmoved. The same soil that had been measured and recorded long before any HOA existed here. And the worker looked between us, uncertain now, the idle confidence gone, replaced with hesitation. Because even he could sense that something did not line up, and Rebecca noticed it too. So she stepped slightly forward, just enough to reassert control of the situation, and told him to continue, that everything was approved, and he hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning back toward the truck. And that fraction was all I needed to see, because it told me the system she was relying on was not as solid as she believed. It just had not been challenged correctly yet. And as the engine revved slightly and the truck inched forward, preparing to shape the ground that had already been taken, I stepped back, not in retreat, but in calculation, because this was no longer about stopping what they were doing in that moment. It was about understanding exactly how far they were willing to go, and making sure that whatever came next would not just respond to it, but end it completely. I let the truck move, let the tires press deeper into that strip of dirt like they already owned it, because sometimes the worst thing you can do is react too early. And as the engine noise faded into the background and the workers focused on their measurements, I stepped back onto my driveway and pulled my phone out, not to record, not to argue, but to start the process the way it actually matters, quiet, documented, and precise. And the first call I made was to the county records office, the same number I had saved years ago when I first bought the property, because back then I did not just trust the paperwork handed to me at closing, I verified it. Every line, every coordinate, every note about easements and access rights. And the woman on the other end recognized my name after a moment, not because I was special, but because people who ask detailed questions about land tend to stand out. And I asked her to pull the original survey, the certified one, the one filed before the subdivision even existed. And while she searched, I could hear the faint clicking of keys, the low hum of office noise in the background. And out in front of me, the crew continued marking the ground with small flags, bright orange against the dirt, each one placed like a quiet assumption about where things belonged. And when she came back on the line, her tone shifted slightly, more attentive, because she found what I expected she would find, a clear boundary, recorded in feet and inches, with no shared access, no easement, nothing that gave anyone the right to cross that line without permission. And I thanked her, asked for a digital copy to be sent immediately, and ended the call. And for a second, I just stood there with the phone still in my hand, feeling that confirmation settle in. Because there is a difference between knowing something and having it documented, and documentation changes how you move next. And I walked back toward the edge of the property, the sun higher now, warming the ground. The smell of dust stronger as the truck shifted position again. And I called out to the foreman, asked him to pause for a minute, and he looked over, hesitant, glancing toward Rebecca, who was still nearby, watching with that same composed expression. And I held up my phone, not aggressively, just enough to signal that I had something concrete. And I told him the work he was doing was crossing a recorded property line, that there was no easement, no authorization, and that continuing could put him in a position he did not want to be in. And for a moment he froze, the uncertainty back in his posture, because contractors understand liability in a way homeowners do not. And he turned toward Rebecca again, waiting, and she stepped forward, smooth as ever, her voice calm, explaining that everything had been approved through the HOA, that the county documentation was outdated, that adjustments had been made under community authority, and she said it like it was fact, like the words themselves could replace recorded data. And I watched the foreman process that, watched the tension between what he was hearing and what he knew about how property law actually works. And I could see him leaning toward caution. But then Rebecca added one more thing, something about liability coverage through the HOA, about how his company would be protected. And that was enough to push him back into motion, because protection on paper, even if it is thin, often outweighs hesitation in the moment, and the engine started up again, louder this time, more committed, and I felt that shift, that moment where the first attempt to stop it did not hold, where the system she was using absorbed the resistance and kept moving forward. And that is when I understood that this was not going to be resolved by standing in front of a truck or making calls in real time, because she had already built a buffer around herself, layers of assumption and authority that made it look legitimate enough to keep things moving. And as the machine rolled forward, shaping the ground further, turning that open strip into something that looked more and more like a shared path, I stepped back again, not because I had run out of options, but because I had just confirmed something more important than stopping them right then. I had confirmed exactly how far she was willing to push without real backing. And that kind of overreach always leaves a weakness somewhere. You just have to find it. And as I walked back toward my house, the sound of the engine fading slightly behind me, I was already thinking past the moment, past the truck, past the dirt being moved, because whatever I did next was not going to interrupt her plan. It was going to collapse it. By early afternoon, the ground did not look like my property anymore. It looked like a project in progress, the kind you drive past and assume has always been there because it already feels intentional. The dirt leveled in long, smooth passes, the edges softened where my fence line used to break the space, and those bright orange flags now forming a loose guide that suggested direction instead of boundary. And I stood at my kitchen window for a moment, watching it through the glass with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand, the faint bitterness of it lingering on my tongue while the low hum of machinery carried through the walls, steady, methodical, like something being built rather than something being taken. And that was the part that mattered, because perception is half the battle in situations like this. If it looks established, people stop questioning how it got there. And I could already see neighbors slowing their cars as they passed, glancing over with mild curiosity instead of concern, because to them it probably looked like improvement, like something organized by the HOA for the benefit of everyone. And that is exactly how Rebecca wanted it. Not loud, not forced, just quietly accepted until it became normal. And I set the cup down on the counter and walked back outside, the heat heavier now, pressing down on the open space where shade used to fall from the fence panels, and the smell of disturbed earth stronger, mixed with that faint chemical note from treated soil. And as I stepped onto the edge of the worked area, I noticed something new, something that had not been there that morning. A temporary sign staked into the ground, white background, clean lettering, future community access lane. And the words sat there like a statement of fact, not a proposal, not a discussion, but a declaration. And I felt a small shift in my chest when I read it. Not anger, something sharper, because that sign was not just for me. It was for everyone else, a way to anchor the idea before anyone had the chance to question it. And I walked closer, crouching down slightly to look at how it had been placed, the stake driven shallow. Quick install, something meant to be visible, not permanent. And that detail told me everything about the stage we were in. This was still the early phase, still flexible, still reliant on perception rather than structure. And that meant it could still be undone, but not by arguing, not by pointing at documents in the middle of the day while machines were already moving. Because once motion starts, it carries its own momentum. And I straightened up, letting my eyes follow the line they were shaping, tracing it from one end of my property to the other, calculating distance without needing a tape, because I knew these measurements by memory now, had walked them enough times to feel them under my feet, and I could see exactly how far they were pushing, how much they were taking, not in a dramatic way, not half my yard or anything obvious, just enough to create continuity, enough to connect their existing path to something new, and that kind of adjustment is the hardest to fight in real time, because it looks reasonable if you do not know the original line. And that is when it clicked fully, not just what she was doing, but how she expected it to play out. She was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to make the argument irrelevant by the time anyone realized there was one. And I let out a slow breath, the warm air carrying that dry, dusty smell into my lungs, grounding me in the moment, because understanding the strategy meant I could stop reacting to the surface and start working underneath it. And I turned away from the site, not because I was giving up the space, but because I had already seen enough, already gathered what I needed from this phase, and as I walked back toward the house, the sound of the machinery fading slightly behind me, I could feel the shift happening internally, that transition from observation to preparation, because whatever came next was not going to happen in broad daylight with engines running and people watching. It was going to happen when the noise stopped, when the assumptions settled, when everything they built on that line believed it was safe. And that is when you change the outcome. By the time the sun started dropping low enough to stretch long shadows across the newly flattened strip of dirt, the machines had already packed up and left, their absence almost louder than their presence had been, leaving behind a space that looked finished enough to be accepted, but incomplete enough to still be changed. And that in-between state is where mistakes hide. Because people assume what they see at the end of the day is what will be there tomorrow. And as I stepped back out onto the property, the air had cooled. Just enough to carry a different scent now. Less diesel, more earth, the ground settling after being disturbed. And I walked the line slowly, boots pressing into soil that had not yet fully compacted, feeling the slight give under each step. And that was when I noticed it. Something subtle, something easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The alignment of the flags, not just their placement, but their spacing, slightly inconsistent. Some closer together, some farther apart, and I crouched down next to one, brushing away a thin layer of loose dirt around its base, and beneath it I saw the marking, a faint spray of chalk, bright against the darker soil, forming a line that did not match the coordinates I had memorized. It was close enough that most people would never question it, but it was off by just enough to shift the entire boundary several inches inward across the length of the property. And that kind of adjustment compounds over distance. What looks like nothing at one end becomes feet at the other, and I could feel that quiet confirmation settle in. Not a surprise, but proof, because this was not just expansion, it was recalibration. They were not just using my land, they were redefining it. And I stood up, scanning the rest of the markers, tracing that adjusted line in my head, seeing how it connected to the rest of the neighborhood layout, how it created a smoother path, a cleaner curve for what they wanted to build. And I could not help but notice how efficient it was, how deliberately it had been planned, because shifting a boundary by inches instead of feet avoids attention, avoids immediate resistance, and over time it becomes the new normal. And I pulled my phone out again, not to call this time, but to document, taking clear photos of each marker, each chalk line, each reference point, making sure to capture angles that showed the relationship between them. Because evidence is not just about having proof, it is about having proof that holds up when someone else tries to reinterpret it. And as I moved along the line, the last of the sunlight catching the edges of the disturbed ground, I noticed one more detail that made everything click into place. A small metal pin partially buried near where the original corner marker had been, not removed, just pushed aside, like something they did not think mattered anymore. And I knelt down, brushing it clean with my hand, revealing the stamped top. The survey identification number still visible, still tied to the official record, and I let out a slow breath as I held it between my fingers, because that pin was the anchor, the fixed point that everything else was supposed to align to, and they had not destroyed it. They had ignored it, which meant they were building a new reference system on top of the old one, hoping no one would compare the two. And that was the crack, the exact kind of flaw you look for when something feels too smooth on the surface, because systems that rely on perception always leave behind something real that does not move with them. And I stood up, slipping the pin into my pocket, not as a trophy but as a reference, and looked out across the line one more time, seeing both versions of it now, the one they were creating and the one that actually existed, layered over each other like two different maps of the same space. And in that moment, I understood exactly where the leverage was, not in stopping the work they had already started, but in forcing both versions of that line to exist at the same time until the contradiction could not be ignored. And as the light faded further and the neighborhood settled into its evening quiet, I turned back toward the house, the plan forming not as a reaction but as a sequence, because once you find the point where a system breaks, everything after that becomes about applying pressure in the right place at the right time, and I finally knew where that place was. That night, I did not turn on the television, did not scroll through anything, did not distract myself with noise, because once you see a flaw in a system like that, your mind does not let it go. It keeps pulling at it until the entire structure starts to show its weak points. and I sat at my dining table with the overhead light casting a clean circle across the surface, spreading out everything I had gathered. The digital survey pulled up on my laptop, the photos I had taken lined up on my phone, the small metal pin set right in front of me like a physical reminder of what was real and what was being rewritten, and the quiet in the house felt different now, not empty, but focused, like the kind of silence you get on a job site before a major pour, when everyone knows something important is about to happen. And I zoomed in on the survey first, tracing the coordinates with my finger across the screen, each measurement exact, each angle locked, the boundary line defined not by opinion but by math. And then I compared it to the images I had taken that afternoon, flipping between them slowly, matching landmarks, checking distances, aligning the chalk markings with the recorded points, and the difference was consistent, not random, a deliberate shift of just under 8 inches along the entire stretch, enough to create usable space for their access lane without triggering immediate suspicion. And I leaned back slightly, letting that number settle in, because 8 inches over a span of nearly 120 feet is not a mistake. It is a decision, and I could feel the pieces connecting in a way that made the whole situation sharper, clearer, because this was not just about my property. This was about how they were structuring control, inch by inch, line by line. And I reached for the pin, turning it between my fingers, the metal cool against my skin, the stamped number still visible under the light. And I remembered exactly where I found it, offset from the chalk line. Ignored but not removed. And that told me something critical. They did not want to erase the original boundary completely. They wanted it to exist quietly underneath their version, so that if anyone ever questioned it, they could blur the distinction, claim adjustment, claim interpretation, create just enough confusion to avoid a clean challenge. And I set the pin down next to the laptop, aligning it visually with the digital line on the screen, the real anchor against the official record. And that is when the strategy fully formed, not as an idea, but as a sequence of steps that fit together with the same precision as the measurements I was looking at. Because if they were relying on a shifted line to support everything they were building, then the only way to break that system was to force the original line back into physical reality in a way that could not be ignored, something that did not depend on explanation or argument, something that stood exactly where the law said it should. And I opened a new tab, pulling up specifications, not casually, not browsing, but selecting materials with intent, concrete mix ratios for structural footing, steel post ratings, anchor depths required for permanent installation, the kind of details I had worked with for years, the kind that do not change based on opinion or HOA guidelines. And as I moved through each specification, the plan became more solid, more defined, because this was no longer about replacing a fence. This was about establishing a boundary that could not be adjusted, not by 8 inches, not by interpretation, not by anything short of tearing out something built to last. And I could feel that steady focus settle in deeper, the same one I relied on when coordinating crews and timelines, when everything had to align perfectly for the outcome to hold. And I reached for my phone again, this time not to document or verify, but to call the people I trusted, the ones I had worked with before, the ones who understood that when I asked for precision, I meant exact. And as the line rang, I looked once more at the survey, at the pin, at the images of those shifted markers. And I knew that what I was about to build was not just going to restore what had been taken, it was going to define it in a way that no one in that neighborhood would ever be able to overlook again. The call did not go to voicemail, which told me everything I needed to know about who I was dealing with on the other end. Because people who answer on the second ring at 8:43 at night are either busy or reliable. And in this case it was both. And when Marcus picked up, his voice carried that familiar background noise of a shop still open, faint clatter of metal, the low hum of fluorescent lights. And I did not waste time with small talk. I told him I needed a line set, not approximate, not adjusted, exact to recorded survey coordinates. And there was a short pause on the line, not hesitation, just processing. And then he asked the only question that mattered, how soon? And I looked at the clock on the wall, then back at the spread of documents in front of me, the pin, the measurements, the photos, and I said tomorrow night. And there was a slight shift in his tone, a recognition that this was not routine work, but he did not push back. He just said he would bring laser equipment, steel posts, and asked if I wanted standard spacing or reinforced intervals. And I told him reinforced, 12-foot spacing with deeper anchors, and he gave a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that means the plan is already forming on his side. And we ended the call without anything unnecessary, because when you work with people who understand precision, you do not need to explain the reasons, you just define the outcome. And after I set the phone down, I made one more call, this time to a surveyor I had worked with before, someone who understood both the technical side and the legal weight behind it. And when he answered, I told him I needed a verification, not during business hours, not scheduled through the usual channels, but on site, direct alignment with recorded markers. And he asked me if there was a dispute, and I told him there would be if I did not handle it correctly. And that was enough for him. He agreed to meet the next evening, said he would bring the original coordinate data and a calibrated laser level. And when the call ended, I felt that sequence lock into place, each part of it connected, each role defined, not as a reaction but as a coordinated move. And I stood up from the table, the chair sliding back softly against the floor, and walked toward the back door, stepping outside into the cooler night air. The neighborhood quiet now, most lights dimmed, the kind of calm that makes everything feel settled even when it is not. And I looked out toward the line again, now just a dark stretch against the lighter ground, barely visible in the low light. But I could still see it in my head, both versions, the one they had marked and the one that actually existed, and I could almost hear the difference between them, the subtle misalignment that would not matter to anyone who had not measured it, but would matter completely once it was made physical again. And I walked along the edge one more time, slower now, not searching, just confirming, counting steps, feeling distance, letting the space imprint itself one last time before it changed. And as I reached the far end, I stopped and looked back across the full length of it, imagining the posts, the footing, the line drawn in something that does not shift under pressure. And I felt that steady focus settle in fully, the kind that removes doubt, because by this point it was no longer about whether I was going to act. It was about executing it correctly. And I turned back toward the house, the gravel crunching under my boots, the sound sharp in the quiet. And I knew that by the time the next day ended, the version of this boundary that existed now would no longer be the one anyone had to interpret. It would be the one that stood there in material, in alignment, in a form that does not negotiate. The next day moved slower than usual, not because time had changed, but because everything I did was measured against what was coming that night. Every step deliberate, every detail accounted for. And by late afternoon, the neighborhood looked exactly like it had the day before, which was the point, because nothing about what I was about to do needed attention before it was finished. And as the sun started dropping again, casting that same long light across the adjusted ground, I could see the path they had shaped settling into place, already beginning to look like it belonged there. The flags still marking their version of the line, the temporary sign still standing like a quiet claim, and I stood at the edge of my driveway watching it, not with frustration, but with clarity, because this was the last moment it would exist uncontested. And just after dusk, the first set of headlights rolled in, low beams cutting across the ground in a slow sweep, followed by the steady rumble of a truck pulling up along the street, not into the property, not yet. And Marcus stepped out first, same calm presence, same focus, no unnecessary words, just a nod in my direction as he looked out across the line, taking in the layout, the markers, the spacing. And then the second vehicle arrived, quieter, and the surveyor stepped out carrying equipment that looked simple to anyone who did not understand it. But I knew better, the tripod, the laser level, the case with the coordinate data loaded in. And the moment they started setting up, the air shifted, not louder, not more intense, just more precise. Because this was not construction yet. This was alignment, and alignment determines everything that follows. And I walked over, handing the surveyor the pin I had recovered, and he took it, examining the stamped number under the light, nodding once as he matched it to the data on his device. And without a word, he moved to the approximate location where it belonged, setting his equipment, calibrating, adjusting, the faint hum of the laser barely audible in the quiet evening. And one by one, reference points began to appear, not visible to anyone else, but clear to us, points that matched the recorded coordinates exactly. Not the chalk lines, not the flags, but the real line, the one that had existed long before anyone decided to reinterpret it. and Marcus watched, arms crossed, already mapping out spacing in his head. And when the surveyor finished marking the true boundary with temporary indicators, Marcus looked at me and asked if I was ready, not casually, but as a confirmation that once this started, it was not stopping halfway, and I nodded, because there was nothing left to decide. And that was when the tools came out, not rushed, not loud, just steady, the kind of movement that comes from experience. And the first hole was drilled exactly on the line, not where the flag stood, but where the coordinates dictated, and the sound of it cut through the quiet, sharp but controlled, and then the next, and the next, each one spaced precisely, 12 feet apart, each one deeper than standard, because this was not temporary, this was foundation, and the smell of fresh concrete soon followed, that distinct mix that always signals permanence. And as the posts were set, steel against earth, anchored in place, I could see the line reappear, not as a suggestion, not as something that could be adjusted, but as something defined by material and measurement, and the contrast was immediate, the chalk lines and flags suddenly looking uncertain, misaligned, almost irrelevant next to something that held its position without explanation, and we worked steadily. Methodically, no wasted motion, no unnecessary conversation, just execution, because at this point the plan was not something we talked about, it was something we were building. And as the final post went in and the last of the concrete was set, I stepped back, looking down the length of it, seeing the boundary fully realized again, not the way it had been before, but stronger, more exact, more visible in its precision. And in that moment, standing there under the dim streetlights with the ground still settling around something that would not move, I knew that whatever happened next would not be a discussion about where the line was. It would be a reaction to something that already existed. And that changes everything. The next morning did not start with noise. It started with stillness, the kind that makes every small sound stand out. The distant hum of a car passing, the faint rustle of leaves, the quiet click of my front door as I stepped outside, and the cool air hit my face. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the light, taking in the line as it stretched across the property, no longer empty, no longer undefined, but anchored, visible, undeniable, the steel posts set and clean. Intervals, the concrete at their base still curing but already solid enough to hold. And the difference was immediate, not just physically but psychologically, because where there had been openness, there was now structure, where there had been assumption, there was now precision, and I could see it in the way the space felt, contained again, measured again, like it had settled back into its correct form overnight. And it did not take long for the rest of the neighborhood to notice, because around 8:15, the first car slowed as it passed, the driver leaning slightly toward the window, eyes tracking the line with quiet curiosity, and then another followed, then a third, and within minutes the stillness shifted into awareness, not loud, not chaotic, just a subtle ripple moving through the street as people realized something had changed. And then I saw her, Rebecca, stepping out onto her driveway again, same measured pace, same controlled posture. But this time there was a pause in her movement, just a fraction longer than usual as her eyes locked onto the line, and even from where I stood, I could see the calculation happening, the comparison between what had been there yesterday and what stood there now, and she started walking toward it, not quickly, but with purpose, her steps precise against the pavement, and I stayed where I was, not approaching, not retreating, just watching, because this was not a confrontation, this was recognition. And when she reached the edge of the property, she stopped, looking down the length of the posts, her expression controlled, but tighter now, the kind of control that requires effort, and she bent slightly, examining one of the bases, probably expecting to find something temporary, something she could dismiss or reinterpret. But there was nothing to reinterpret. The alignment was exact, the spacing consistent, the materials not something you move without planning, and she straightened up, turning her head slightly as if searching for the version of the line she had established, the flags, the chalk, but they were still there, just offset now, visibly misaligned against what had been built, and that contrast did the work for me, because it showed, without explanation, that there were two versions of reality occupying the same space, and only one of them matched the law, and I could see the moment it registered, not as a dramatic reaction, but as a shift in posture, a subtle tightening of her shoulders, a slight narrowing of her eyes. And then she looked toward me, not with the casual confidence from the day before, but with something more focused, more deliberate, and she walked over, stopping just short of the line, careful not to step across it. And she asked, in that same controlled tone, what exactly I thought I was doing, and I answered just as calmly, that I was establishing the boundary according to recorded survey coordinates, nothing more, nothing less. And for a second there was silence between us, the kind that carries more weight than raised voices. And then she said that the HOA had already approved adjustments to that area, that what I had done was not aligned with community decisions, and I could hear the shift in her wording, moving from certainty to justification. And I told her that community decisions do not override recorded property lines, and I let the statement sit there, simple, direct, because it did not need anything else, and behind her I could see one of the workers from the previous day pulling up, slowing the truck as he approached, his eyes moving from the new posts to Rebecca, then to me, uncertainty clear in the way he held the wheel, because now the situation was different. Now there was something in place that could not be ignored or easily moved. And Rebecca glanced back at him, then forward again, recalculating, and I could feel that shift fully now. The moment where control starts to slip, not because of force, but because the foundation it was built on no longer holds. And I stood there, steady, grounded in something that did not depend on approval or interpretation, and I knew that whatever came next, it would not be about deciding where the line should be. It would be about dealing with the fact that it was already set. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. It happened in small adjustments that built on each other until the outcome became unavoidable. And I could see it starting right there on the street as more vehicles slowed down, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, because people understand structure when they see it, even if they do not understand the details behind it. And the line that stood there now did not look like a suggestion. It looked like something final, something that belonged. And that changed how everyone around it reacted, including the worker who had just pulled up, because instead of continuing forward like the day before, he parked along the curb, stepping out slower, his eyes moving from the posts to Rebecca, waiting for direction that no longer came as easily as it had before, and she tried to hold that control. I could see it in the way she straightened slightly, adjusting her posture, shifting her weight as if preparing to reassert authority. But this time there was something missing. Not confidence exactly, but certainty, because certainty requires alignment, and what stood between us now was not aligned with what she had set in motion, and she turned toward the worker, telling him to continue as planned, her voice still steady, still composed, but the difference was there, subtle but real, and he hesitated, just enough to show that the equation had changed, because now continuing meant acting against something visible, something fixed, something that did not match the instructions he had been given, and he looked back at the line, then at her, and asked if there was updated documentation, not aggressively, just carefully, and that question landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because it shifted the conversation from assumption to requirement, and for a moment she did not answer immediately, which told me everything, because if the documentation existed, it would have been presented already, and instead she responded with the same language she had used before, referencing HOA authority, community decisions, the benefit of the neighborhood, but the words did not land the same way now, not with the posts standing exactly where the law said they should be, not with the visible misalignment between what was built and what had been marked, and the worker nodded slowly, but he did not move, and that stillness spread, because others were watching now, neighbors standing at the edges of their driveways, not intervening, just observing. And observation is powerful when it is focused, because it removes the ability to redefine what is happening. And I could feel that moment settle, the one where momentum shifts from one side to the other, not dramatically, not loudly, but definitively. And Rebecca looked around briefly, taking in the attention, the hesitation, the visible contradiction, and when she spoke again, her tone changed just slightly, not losing control, but adjusting strategy, saying that the situation would need to be reviewed, that there might have been discrepancies in the initial markings, and that was the first real acknowledgement, not of fault, but of conflict, and that is all it takes, because once conflict is acknowledged, the original assumption no longer holds, and the worker stepped back toward his truck, not instructed, just choosing caution, and the engines that had defined the previous day stayed quiet. And I stood there without moving, without adding anything. Because nothing needed to be added. The line itself was doing the work, and after a moment, Rebecca turned away, not abruptly, not defeated, but recalculating, walking back toward her driveway with that same measured pace. Only now it carried a different weight, and as she stepped away from the boundary, I could feel the space settle again, not into uncertainty, but into clarity. Because what had been abstract before was now physical, what had been assumed was now defined, and the system she had been building no longer had a clean path forward, because it had run directly into something that did not adjust. And as the morning moved on and the neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm, the line remained exactly where it was, unchanged, unmoved, holding its position without needing to argue for it. And that is how you know something is real, not because someone says it is, but because it stands there whether anyone agrees with it or not. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened on the surface, no loud confrontations, no official notices taped to doors, no sudden reversals announced at community meetings. And that was exactly how you could tell everything had already changed, because real shifts do not need to announce themselves. They settle quietly into place and let everything else adjust around them. And every morning when I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the line, not because it was new anymore, but because it felt correct, the steel catching the early light, the concrete bases now fully cured, solid and unmoving. And beyond it the ground that had been shaped for something else remained untouched. The flags gone by the second day, the temporary sign removed without explanation, like it had never been there at all, and the absence of those markers said more than any statement could have, because it meant the version of the boundary they had tried to establish could not hold against what now stood there. And I would see Rebecca occasionally, always at a distance, still composed, still controlled, but the space between us had changed, not physically, but in definition. Because she no longer crossed that line even visually, no longer referenced that stretch of land as shared, and at the next HOA meeting, her language shifted subtly, discussions about community access replaced with more general terms, broader ideas that did not anchor to specific locations, and no one mentioned my property directly, but everyone knew, because once something becomes visible, once it stands there in a way that cannot be ignored, it reshapes how people think about what is possible. And I noticed something else too, something quieter. Neighbors who had never questioned anything before started asking small questions, not confrontational, just curious about property lines, about documentation, about where exactly things were supposed to be. And that is how systems change, not all at once, but through awareness, through the realization that boundaries are not flexible just because someone says they are. And one afternoon as I walked along the line again, the gravel crunching under my boots, the air warm and still, I stopped at the midpoint, reaching out to rest my hand lightly against one of the steel posts, feeling the cool surface under my palm, the slight texture where it met the concrete. And I thought about how this had started, with a sound in the dark, something removed, something assumed to be insignificant, and how it had ended here, with something that did not rely on assumption at all, something that defined itself simply by existing in the right place. And I realized that was the difference, not just between offense and what stood there now, but between reaction and resolution. Because reacting would have meant arguing, pushing back in the moment, trying to stop something already in motion, but resolution meant stepping outside of that moment, understanding the system, and then placing something into it that could not be moved by the same forces. And as I stood there, the line stretching out in both directions, clean, precise, anchored to something deeper than opinion, I let out a slow breath, the kind that carries a sense of completion rather than relief, because this was never about winning a dispute, it was about restoring a definition. And definitions, when they are built correctly, do not need to be defended. They just stand there, shaping everything around them. And I turned back toward the house, leaving the line exactly where it belonged, knowing that from this point forward, it would not be questioned in the same way again. Not because people agreed with it, but because it had been made real in a way that left no room for interpretation, and that is the kind of boundary that lasts.